My name is Brooke Carter, and I'm 28 years old. Last Tuesday evening, I walked into my childhood kitchen expecting a casual family dinner, but instead found myself trapped in what felt like an ambush. Mom sat across from me with that familiar determined expression, while Dad occupied his usual spot at the head of the table, silent as always. "Your sister's struggling with some financial issues," Mom announced, her voice carrying that tone that meant this wasn't a discussion but a declaration. "She's gotten herself into some gambling debt, and frankly, we think you're the only one who can handle this situation." Dad just nodded his approval, never saying a word, but his silence spoke volumes about where this conversation was headed. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If this story resonates with you or if you've dealt with family drama like this, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you won't believe how deep this family manipulation rabbit hole goes, so stick around to see how I finally learned to fight back against years of being the family's designated problem solver. Growing up in the Carter household meant understanding your role from an early age. Haley, my younger sister by 3 years, had always been the delicate flower who needed protection from life's harsh realities. Meanwhile, I was cast as the responsible one, the child who could handle anything thrown my way. This wasn't just family dynamics playing out naturally, it was a carefully orchestrated system that my parents had perfected over decades. When we were teenagers, I watched my college fund disappear overnight so Haley could attend an expensive art school in California. "Brooke's so smart, she'll find a way to pay for college herself," Mom had said, as if my academic achievements somehow made me less deserving of financial support. I worked 3 jobs throughout my undergraduate years, surviving on ramen noodles and 4 hours of sleep, while Haley posted Instagram photos of her weekend trips to Napa Valley with her art school friends. The pattern continued into adulthood. When Haley needed help with rent, I was expected to contribute. When she wrecked her car, somehow it became my responsibility to help her get back on her feet. Every family gathering included subtle hints about how successful I'd become in marketing, how I could afford to help out more since I'd landed that promotion last year. That Tuesday evening, as Mom launched into her prepared speech about family obligations, I could see the same manipulation tactics at play. She started with the emotional manipulation, her eyes welling up with crocodile tears as she spoke about their advancing age. "We're getting older, Brooke, and what if something happens to us? Who's going to take care of Haley then?" Dad's strategic silence was perhaps even more infuriating than Mom's theatrics. He'd perfected the art of appearing reasonable while letting Mom deliver the guilt trips, maintaining plausible deniability while still getting his way. "The thing is," Mom continued, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd conveniently had ready, "Haley's situation is more serious than we initially thought. She owes some people money, and they're not the patient type, if you know what I mean." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dad finally spoke, his voice measured and calm. "Your mother and I have discussed this extensively, and we believe the best solution is for Haley to stay with you temporarily while she gets back on her feet." I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the same feeling I'd experienced countless times when my parents had volunteered my resources without consulting me first. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know. "This wasn't thousands, this was tens of thousands. She just needs a safe place to stay and some guidance from someone who's got their life together," Mom pressed on. "You've got that beautiful downtown apartment with the spare bedroom. It's perfect." The way she said it made it clear this wasn't a request but an expectation. Dad nodded again, adding his weight to Mom's argument without having to voice his own demands. I tried to mount a defense, explaining how my work schedule was demanding, how I valued my personal space, how I wasn't equipped to be someone's financial advisor or life coach. But every objection I raised was met with more guilt and manipulation. "Family helps family," Mom said firmly. "That's what we do in this household." The irony wasn't lost on me that this family helps family principle seemed to flow in only one direction. By the end of that horrible evening, I found myself agreeing to a temporary arrangement that would allow Haley to stay with me for just a few weeks while she figured out her next steps. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just signed up for something far more complicated than a simple roommate situation. I had no idea how right I was. Haley arrived at my apartment the following Saturday with enough luggage to suggest she was planning a permanent relocation rather than a temporary stay. 3 large suitcases, several boxes of personal items, and a garment bag filled with clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She swept through my carefully organized space like a hurricane, immediately claiming the guest bedroom and bathroom as her personal domain. Within the first week, I noticed subtle but concerning changes in my living environment. My expensive skincare products were being used without permission, their levels dropping noticeably each day. Haley would borrow my clothes without asking, returning them wrinkled and sometimes stained. When I gently mentioned that I'd prefer she ask before using my belongings, she looked at me with wounded eyes and said, "I thought we were family." I didn't realize I needed permission to exist in my temporary home. The real shock came when I discovered credit card bills hidden in her personal items while looking for my missing earrings. Haley wasn't just dealing with old gambling debts, she was actively accumulating new ones. Online casino charges, sports betting websites, even lottery ticket purchases through various apps. The amounts were staggering, and the dates were recent, some as current as the day before. When I confronted her about the continued gambling, Haley's response was a masterclass in deflection and manipulation. She broke down into tears, claiming that the stress of being homeless and unwanted had driven her to seek comfort in familiar habits. "I know it's wrong," she sobbed, "but I feel so lost and alone. I thought if I could just win some money back, I could prove to everyone that I'm not a complete failure." The first major incident happened 3 weeks into her stay. I had to work late on a crucial client presentation, and I came home around 10 p.m. to find my apartment transformed into a party venue. Music was blasting, strangers were using my kitchen and bathroom, and my neighbors were gathered in the hallway looking furious. The building management had already received multiple noise complaints, and I was formally warned about violating the lease's quiet enjoyment clause. Haley's defense was as infuriating as it was predictable. "I was just trying to make some friends," she said, seemingly oblivious to the chaos she'd created. "I've been so isolated lately, and I thought having a few people over would help me feel more normal." "You're being really controlling about this." She somehow managed to make me feel guilty for being upset that she'd violated my home and potentially jeopardized my housing situation. The situation escalated when my parents became involved. Mom called the next morning, having already heard Haley's version of events. "She says you're making her feel unwelcome in her temporary home," Mom said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment. "She's been through so much, Brooke. Can't you try to be more understanding?" Dad's voice joined the conversation from the background, adding his agreement to Mom's assessment of my alleged unreasonableness. It was during this period that Derek entered the picture. Haley introduced him as a supportive friend she'd met through a support group, but something about him immediately set off alarm bells. He was charming in an oily way, with expensive clothes that didn't quite match his claims of being between jobs. He started spending more and more time at my apartment, treating my space like his personal hangout spot and my refrigerator like his personal supply depot. Derek had an unsettling way of inserting himself into conversations about Haley's recovery, offering advice that seemed designed to enable rather than heal. "She's dealing with trauma," he'd say whenever I expressed concern about her continued gambling. "Pressure and criticism will only make it worse." He'd encourage Haley to see my attempts at setting boundaries as attacks on her mental health, framing my reasonable requests as evidence of my lack of compassion. The writing was on the wall, but I was still trying to honor my commitment to helping family. I had no idea that Haley and Derek were already planning their next phase of exploitation, or that my parents' manipulation was about to reach levels I'd never experienced before. My peaceful, organized life was becoming unrecognizable, and the worst was yet to come. The discovery that changed everything happened on a mundane Thursday morning while I was organizing my desk to prepare for the workday ahead. I noticed several checks missing from my checkbook, along with some irregularities in my bank account that I'd initially attributed to my own oversight. When I called the bank to inquire about the discrepancies, the customer service representative calmly informed me that several checks had been cashed over the past 2 weeks, all bearing what appeared to be my signature. The amounts were significant, $300 here, $500 there, culminating in a devastating $1,200 check made out to cash. When the bank emailed me copies of the canceled checks, I stared in disbelief at my own signature, perfectly forged in Haley's careful handwriting. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My sister wasn't just using my space and belongings, she was literally stealing my identity to fund her gambling addiction. My grandmother's jewelry box, which I kept on my bedroom dresser, was the next casualty. The antique pieces that had been passed down through 3 generations of Carter women were simply gone one morning. When I asked Haley about them, she gave me a performance worthy of an Academy Award, complete with shocked gasps and wounded innocence. I borrowed a couple of pieces for a job interview, she finally admitted when pressed. I was going to tell you, but you've been so stressed lately. I'll pay you back when I get the position. The job interviews she claimed to be attending were elaborate fiction. I started tracking her schedule more carefully and discovered that her supposed interview appointments coincided perfectly with the operating hours of the local casino. Meanwhile, my credit card statements revealed charges I'd never authorized, expensive dinners at steakhouses, shopping sprees at designer boutiques, and regular payments to various gambling platforms. Haley had somehow gained access to my financial information and was using it as her personal ATM. When I confronted her with the evidence, Haley's response was a calculated mixture of gaslighting and emotional manipulation. "You're being paranoid," she said, her voice taking on that familiar wounded tone. "I've never touched your credit cards. Maybe you're just forgetting some purchases because you've been working so much. And the checks, well, you said I could ask for help when I needed it." I was just too embarrassed to ask directly. The situation reached a breaking point when my parents arrived for an unexpected visit that felt more like a coordinated intervention. They'd clearly been briefed by Haley about my increasingly controlling behavior and had come to set me straight about family obligations. Mom launched into a prepared speech about my lack of compassion, while Dad sat there nodding his approval of every accusation. "Haley tells us you've been making her feel like a criminal in her own temporary home," Mom said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "She's going through the hardest time of her life, and instead of supporting her, you're nitpicking about every little thing. That's not the daughter we raised." Dad finally spoke up, his voice carrying more authority than I'd heard from him in years. "Your mother's right. Family means sacrifice, and right now, your sister needs you to step up." It was during this ambush that Derek's true nature became clear. He arrived halfway through the confrontation, armed with psychological terminology and manipulation tactics that he'd clearly researched in advance. "Brooke's exhibiting classic control patterns," he said, addressing my parents as if I weren't in the room. "She's using financial pressure and emotional withholding to maintain power over Haley's recovery process. It's actually quite damaging to someone in Haley's vulnerable state." Derek's background, which I discovered through some desperate internet searching, was a tapestry of red flags. Multiple arrests for financial fraud, a history of targeting vulnerable women, and a pattern of inserting himself into family conflicts to exploit the chaos for personal gain. He'd been coaching Haley on manipulation techniques, teaching her how to forge signatures and access financial accounts, all while positioning himself as her protector against my alleged cruelty. The realization that Derek had been orchestrating much of Haley's behavior was both relieving and terrifying. It meant my sister might be more victim than villain, but it also meant I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a gambling-addicted family member. Derek wasn't just enabling Haley's problems, he was actively exploiting them for his own benefit, and my parents' intervention had given him exactly the legitimacy he needed to continue his manipulation. As my parents left that evening, thoroughly convinced that I was the problem in this family drama, I realized I was completely alone in recognizing the true scope of what was happening. Haley wasn't just struggling with addiction, she was being actively manipulated by a professional con artist who saw our family dysfunction as an opportunity for financial exploitation. The worst part was that my own parents had become unwitting allies in this scheme, their genuine concern for Haley's welfare making them perfect tools for Derek's manipulation. The stress of managing the chaos at home began manifesting in ways I couldn't hide at work. Years of maintaining a perfect professional facade crumbled as I found myself staying up until 3 a.m. trying to untangle the financial mess Haley and Derek had created, then attempting to function normally during crucial business meetings on just a few hours of sleep. My usually sharp presentation skills became scattered and unfocused, and my attention to detail suffered dramatically. Marcus, my immediate supervisor and someone I'd always respected, started noticing the changes in my performance during our weekly check-ins. "You seem overwhelmed lately," he observed during one particularly rough morning when I'd arrived 20 minutes late with coffee stains on my blouse. "Is everything okay at home?" I wanted desperately to confide in him, but the shame of my family situation kept me offering vague excuses about temporary stress that would resolve itself soon. The breaking point came during a major client presentation for Henderson Industries, our biggest account of the year. I'd worked on the campaign strategy for months, and it should have been a triumphant moment in my career. Instead, I found myself standing in front of 12 executives, unable to remember key statistics and fumbling through slides I'd rehearsed countless times. The sleep deprivation and constant anxiety had finally caught up with me in the most public way possible. Janet, a colleague who'd always seemed friendly but had recently begun making subtle comments about my changed attitude, wasted no time in capitalizing on my visible struggles. She began spreading rumors throughout the office about my reliability and mental stability, positioning herself as the obvious candidate for my responsibilities should management decide I was no longer capable of handling them. Her whispered conversations with other team members always seemed to stop abruptly when I entered a room. The situation at work was further complicated by Haley's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain contact with me during business hours. She'd call the main office line claiming family emergencies, forcing me to leave important meetings to take calls that invariably turned out to be requests for money or complaints about my unfair treatment of her. The receptionist, Diana, started giving me sympathetic looks as she transferred yet another urgent call from my sister during crucial client negotiations. My parents used my workplace struggles as additional ammunition in their campaign to convince me that I was the problem. "See?" Mom said during one of our increasingly confrontational phone calls. "You can't even handle your own responsibilities anymore. How do you expect to help your sister when you're falling apart yourself?" The circular logic was maddening. They'd created a situation that was destroying my ability to function, then used my dysfunction as evidence that their original assessment was correct. The most humiliating incident occurred when Derek appeared at my office building, claiming to be my concerned brother-in-law and requesting a meeting with my supervisor to discuss my deteriorating mental health. He'd somehow learned enough details about my work schedule to time his arrival during a busy afternoon when several clients were in the building. His polished appearance and seemingly genuine concern initially fooled the security desk, and he made it to the 11th floor before Diana recognized the name from Haley's phone calls. When security escorted Derek from the building, he became aggressive and belligerent, shouting about how I was destroying a vulnerable woman and threatening to expose my abusive behavior to my employers. The scene was witnessed by several clients and colleagues, including Janet, who immediately began speculating about my personal problems and their impact on the company's professional reputation. The HR meeting that followed was one of the most mortifying experiences of my professional life. Sitting across from my manager and the human resources director, I tried to explain that my personal situation was temporary and wouldn't continue affecting my work performance. But the evidence of my recent struggles was undeniable: late arrivals, missed deadlines, the Henderson presentation disaster, and now a public altercation involving someone claiming to be my family member. "We're concerned about you," the HR director said, her voice carrying that careful tone reserved for employees who might be heading toward termination. "These personal issues seem to be significantly impacting your professional responsibilities. We need to discuss what support systems you might need, and what timeline you can give us for resolving these conflicts. The irony wasn't lost on me that Haley and Derek's manipulation had followed me into the one sanctuary I'd thought was safe from their influence. My career, which I'd built through years of dedication and hard work, was now threatened by the very people my family expected me to sacrifice everything to help. As I sat in that sterile conference room trying to salvage my professional reputation, I realized that my attempts to be the responsible family member were actually destroying the life I'd worked so hard to build. The phone call that would change everything came on a rainy Wednesday evening while I was working late, trying to catch up on projects I'd fallen behind on due to the constant chaos at home. Mom's voice sounded more serious than usual as she delivered what she claimed was devastating family news. She and Dad had decided to sell the family home due to unexpected financial pressures that had developed over the past few months. "We never wanted to burden you children with this information," Mom said, her voice heavy with manufactured martyrdom, "but Haley's situation has created some significant financial strain on our retirement plans. We've had to make some difficult decisions about our future." The implication was clear. My sister's problems were forcing my elderly parents out of their home of 30 years, and somehow this was connected to my failure to provide adequate support. Dad's voice joined the call with what sounded like a carefully rehearsed script. "We've been thinking that maybe it's time for the family to make a fresh start together. You've been so successful, Brooke, and maybe this is an opportunity for you to invest in something larger that could accommodate all of us during this transitional period." The suggestion that I should buy a larger home to house my parents and sister was delivered as if it were a reasonable business proposition rather than an outrageous demand. The manipulation reached new heights when Mom casually mentioned that they'd been giving Haley money throughout her entire supposed crisis, completely contradicting their previous claims about their inability to help her financially. "We've been trying to help as much as we can," Mom admitted when pressed for details, "but we can't keep draining our savings indefinitely. That's why we need you to step up with a more permanent solution." Bank statements that I managed to obtain through some strategic questioning revealed the shocking truth. My parents had withdrawn over $40,000 from their retirement savings to fund Haley's gambling habit and Derek's schemes. They'd been enabling her addiction while simultaneously guilt-tripping me for not doing enough to help. The financial crisis forcing them to sell their home was entirely self-created through their misguided attempts to rescue Haley from consequences she desperately needed to face. Just when I thought the situation couldn't become more manipulative, Haley announced she was pregnant. The timing was suspiciously convenient, coming just days after my parents had suggested the family housing arrangement and just weeks after Derek had started becoming more aggressive about accessing my resources. The pregnancy announcement was delivered with maximum emotional impact, complete with tears about bringing a child into such an unstable family situation. Derek's response to the pregnancy news revealed more about his character than I'd previously understood. Rather than stepping up as a supportive partner, he became evasive and defensive when questioned about his plans for supporting Haley and the baby. His expensive lifestyle suddenly became harder to explain when faced with the prospect of actual financial responsibility for a child. The truth about Derek emerged through some persistent investigation that revealed he was already married to another woman across town, with 2 children he'd abandoned when his various schemes fell apart. He'd been using Haley as both a meal ticket and a convenient cover for his criminal activities, and the pregnancy threatened to complicate his ability to disappear when things got too hot. Mom's response to the pregnancy was to immediately increase the pressure on me to provide support. "That baby is going to be your niece or nephew," she said during what felt like the 100th guilt-inducing phone call that week. "Family takes care of family, and right now, Haley needs stability more than ever. You're the only one in this family who has the resources to provide that stability." Dad's rare moment of lengthy speech came during a family dinner where he outlined what he saw as my obligations to the family. "Success comes with responsibility," he said, his voice carrying more authority than I'd heard from him since childhood. "You've been blessed with opportunities that your sister hasn't had, and now it's time to use those blessings to help the people who helped you achieve them." The emotional manipulation reached its peak when Haley claimed to have a pregnancy-related medical emergency that required immediate hospital attention. The frantic phone calls, the rushed trip to the emergency room, the dramatic scenes in the waiting area all seemed designed to prove how desperately she needed my support and protection. Mom and Dad flanked her bedside like protective guards, reinforcing the narrative that I was the family's only hope for salvation. The hospital visit, however, revealed more than my family had bargained for. Medical tests showed that not only was there no pregnancy emergency, but there was no pregnancy at all. Haley had been lying about being pregnant, using fake pregnancy tests and manufactured symptoms to manipulate the family's emotions. The doctor who examined her was confused by the discrepancy between her claims and the medical evidence, leading to uncomfortable questions that exposed the entire deception. Even when confronted with undeniable medical proof that the pregnancy was fabricated, my parents struggled to acknowledge the extent of Haley's manipulation. Mom's first response was to suggest that the stress of the situation might have caused a very early miscarriage that didn't show up on tests. Dad wondered aloud whether the hospital might have made an error. Their willingness to believe any explanation except the obvious truth showed just how deeply they'd become invested in maintaining their narrative of Haley as a victim needing rescue. It was Marcus who first offered me the lifeline I desperately needed, though it took weeks of careful observation before he felt comfortable addressing what he'd been witnessing. During a quiet moment after a particularly difficult team meeting where I'd struggled to focus, he pulled me aside and said something that changed my perspective entirely. Whatever's happening in your personal life, it's not your fault that other people's choices are affecting your ability to function. His words hit me like a revelation because nobody in my family had ever suggested that I wasn't responsible for solving everyone else's problems. Marcus began sharing articles about family manipulation and toxic relationship dynamics, never pressuring me to discuss specifics but making it clear that he recognized unhealthy patterns when he saw them. His professional mentorship gradually evolved into genuine friendship as he helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't selfishness but necessary self-preservation. Rosa, my neighbor in the apartment across the hall, became another unexpected source of wisdom and support. She'd witnessed the chaos that had erupted in my previously quiet building and had seen enough of life to recognize manipulation when it was happening in front of her. "Honey," she said one morning as we waited for the elevator, "I've raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands, and I can tell you that enabling someone's bad choices isn't the same thing as loving them." Her perspective was particularly valuable because she'd observed Haley's behavior from a neutral position. Rosa had seen Derek coming and going at all hours, had noticed strangers in the building during Haley's unauthorized parties, and had witnessed the dramatic scenes that seemed to occur whenever I tried to set any boundaries. "That girl's got everyone dancing to her tune," Rosa observed with the clarity that comes from not being emotionally invested in family dynamics. The decision to consult with an attorney came after Marcus suggested that what I was experiencing might actually constitute criminal activity rather than just family drama. Patricia, the attorney he recommended, specialized in financial fraud and identity theft cases. During our initial consultation, she listened to my story with the serious attention of someone who'd seen similar situations before. Patricia helped me understand that forgery, identity theft, and financial fraud were serious crimes regardless of whether they were committed by family members. She guided me through the process of gathering evidence, photographing forged checks, documenting unauthorized credit card charges, creating a timeline of incidents, and obtaining witness statements from Rosa and others who'd observed problematic behavior. The evidence collection process was both empowering and heartbreaking as I documented the extent of the violations that had occurred in my own home. Bank statements showed a clear pattern of unauthorized access, security camera footage from my building revealed Derek entering my apartment when I wasn't home, and credit monitoring services confirmed that new accounts had been opened using my personal information. My parents' decision to escalate the conflict by appearing at my workplace forced me to make a choice between protecting my professional reputation and maintaining family peace. They arrived during lunch hour, demanding to speak with my supervisor about what they called my cruel treatment of my sister during her mental health crisis. The public confrontation in the office lobby was witnessed by clients and colleagues, including Janet, who seemed delighted by the drama. Marcus's support during this humiliating incident was invaluable. Rather than distancing himself from the chaos, he stepped in as a professional advocate, explaining to building security that these individuals were not authorized to disrupt business operations. His calm, authoritative handling of the situation helped minimize the damage to my reputation while making it clear that my employer supported me during this difficult time. Janet's attempt to use the family drama as ammunition for her own advancement backfired when Stephen, the company's CEO, made an unexpected appearance during the lobby confrontation. Instead of seeing my family's behavior as evidence of my unsuitability for leadership roles, he recognized it as evidence of the external pressures I'd been managing while maintaining my professional responsibilities. Stephen's perspective on the situation surprised everyone, including me. Anyone who can maintain the level of work quality you've sustained while dealing with this kind of personal chaos has demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience we value in leadership positions, he told me privately after the incident. Your family's problems reflect on them, not on you. The fake suicide attempt that Haley staged as her next manipulation tactic was perhaps the most disturbing incident in this entire saga. The frantic call from Derek, the rushed trip to the emergency room, the dramatic scenes of despair and self-harm all seemed designed to prove that my cruelty was literally driving my sister to attempt suicide. Dr. Catherine, the emergency room physician who examined Haley, was straightforward about her assessment. There was no evidence of any actual suicide attempt, but there were clear signs of substance abuse that suggested more serious underlying issues. This appears to be a cry for attention rather than a genuine attempt at self-harm, she told my parents and me privately. However, the substance abuse issues we've detected require immediate professional intervention. Even when presented with medical evidence that contradicted their narrative, my parents initially blamed me for driving Haley to such desperate measures. Mom's first words after speaking with Dr. Catherine were, "See what your lack of support has done to her?" Dad nodded his agreement, adding, "If you'd been more understanding from the beginning, none of this would have happened." But the medical findings forced a conversation that had been long overdue. Haley's blood tests revealed multiple substances in her system, her behavior patterns were consistent with long-term addiction issues, and her manipulation tactics were textbook examples of addiction-driven behavior. For the first time in months, I had professional validation that what I'd been experiencing wasn't normal family conflict but criminal behavior enabled by addiction and manipulated by an experienced con artist. The planning session with Marcus and Rosa felt like a war council as we strategically mapped out how to regain control of my life while protecting myself legally and professionally. Marcus brought his business expertise to the table, helping me understand how to document everything for maximum legal impact, while Rosa provided the emotional support and practical wisdom that comes from decades of life experience. Patricia's legal documentation was thorough and damning, creating an airtight case that would be difficult for anyone to dispute. We had photographic evidence of forged checks, bank records showing unauthorized transactions, credit reports documenting identity theft, and witness statements from multiple sources. The paper trail painted a clear picture of systematic financial fraud that had been occurring over several months. The security cameras I'd installed in my apartment after Patricia's recommendation proved to be absolutely crucial in exposing the full scope of what had been happening in my absence. The footage revealed Haley going through my personal belongings, Derek accessing my home office and photographing financial documents, and evidence of items being removed from my apartment systematically over several weeks. Most shocking was the discovery that Haley had been selling my belongings through various online platforms, using fake accounts to market everything from my grandmother's jewelry to expensive electronics I'd purchased for work. The online sales records showed transactions totaling several $1,000s, money that had presumably gone directly into funding her gambling addiction and Derek's schemes. The decision to cut off all financial support and change the locks on my apartment was both terrifying and liberating. I'd never taken such a definitive stand against my family's expectations, and I knew there would be serious consequences. But Patricia had made it clear that continued access to my home and resources would only enable more criminal activity while making me potentially liable as an accomplice. My parents' reaction to the changed locks was swift and furious. They arrived within hours of Haley's panicked phone call about being locked out of her temporary home, armed with the spare key I'd given them years earlier for emergencies. Their shock at discovering the locks had been changed quickly turned to outrage as they began pounding on my door and demanding entry. The scene in my apartment building's hallway was like something out of a soap opera, with my parents shouting about family betrayal while Rosa and other neighbors watched in amazement. Mom's voice carried throughout the building as she accused me of abandoning my sister during her greatest time of need, while Dad's rare display of anger focused on what he called my ungrateful and selfish behavior toward the family that had supported me. Rosa's decision to call the police when my parents became threatening was exactly the intervention I needed but couldn't bring myself to request. Her objective perspective allowed her to recognize that their behavior had crossed the line from family drama into harassment and potential trespassing. When the officers arrived, they were professional but firm about establishing boundaries that my family had been unwilling to respect. The police report that was filed that evening documented official harassment and trespassing charges, creating a legal record that would be crucial for any future incidents. The officers explained to my parents that their behavior constituted criminal activity regardless of their family relationship to me, and that continued violations would result in arrest and prosecution. Haley's reaction to having her easy money source disappear was more revealing than anything that had happened previously. Without access to my resources, her true desperation became apparent as she cycled through various manipulation tactics in rapid succession. Threats of self-harm, promises of immediate reform, appeals to family loyalty, and finally angry accusations that I was destroying her life out of jealousy and spite. Derek's return to the scene with a new scheme was both predictable and disturbing. He attempted to position himself as a mediator in the family conflict, suggesting that he could help negotiate a solution that would restore family harmony while ensuring Haley got the support she needed. His sudden transformation from Haley's boyfriend to concerned family friend was transparent to everyone except my parents, who were still hoping for a resolution that wouldn't require them to acknowledge their own enabling behavior. The involvement of extended family members as flying monkeys in my parents' manipulation campaign was perhaps the most exhausting aspect of this entire ordeal. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly began calling with concern about the family crisis and my role in making it worse. Their uniformly sympathetic attitude toward Haley and critical stance toward me revealed how effectively my parents had managed to control the family narrative. The discovery of my grandmother's jewelry in a local pawn shop provided the concrete evidence we needed to pursue criminal charges. Patricia accompanied me to retrieve the pieces, and the pawn shop's records clearly showed Derek as the person who'd sold them using falsified identification documents. This evidence finally connected Derek directly to the theft charges and provided proof of his criminal intent that even my parents couldn't rationalize away. The family meeting I called took place in Patricia's conference room, a neutral location where a legal witness could be present and where my parents couldn't control the narrative through emotional manipulation or familiar territory advantages. I'd spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, gathering evidence and rehearsing responses to the guilt trips and accusations I knew would come. Patricia's presence as my legal representative immediately changed the tone of the conversation from family drama to serious legal discussion. Her opening statement was clear and direct: we were there to present evidence of criminal activity and discuss resolution options that would prevent further legal action. The formality of the setting made it impossible for my parents to dismiss this as another family disagreement. The evidence presentation was systematic and devastating. Bank records showing forged checks, credit card statements revealing unauthorized charges, security footage documenting theft from my apartment, and pawn shop records connecting Derek to the sale of stolen jewelry. Each piece of evidence was dated and documented, creating an undeniable timeline of criminal activity that had been occurring over months. My parents' initial response was predictable denial and deflection. Mom immediately began crying and talking about how disappointed she was that I would attack family with lawyers and accusations. Dad's reaction was anger, accusing me of exaggerating minor issues and destroying family relationships over money. But as Patricia methodically presented each piece of evidence, their protests became weaker and less convincing. Derek's criminal background, which Patricia had uncovered through professional investigation services, was perhaps the most shocking revelation for my parents. Multiple arrests for financial fraud, a history of targeting vulnerable women, documented patterns of identity theft, and an outstanding warrant in another state painted a picture of a career criminal who had specifically targeted our family's dysfunction for exploitation. The revelation that Derek was already married with children was the final blow to Haley's elaborate victim narrative. Court records showed an active marriage license, child support obligations he'd been avoiding, and a restraining order filed by his wife for domestic violence and financial abuse. The loving, supportive boyfriend persona he'd presented to our family was completely fabricated. Haley's complete breakdown and confession came after she realized that the evidence was too overwhelming to deny and that Derek had abandoned her as soon as serious legal consequences became likely. Through tears and desperate explanations, she admitted to forging checks, stealing jewelry, using my credit cards without permission, and lying about the pregnancy. Her confession was both heartbreaking and infuriating as she revealed the extent of Derek's manipulation while still trying to minimize her own responsibility. My parents' struggle to maintain their narrative in the face of undeniable evidence was painful to watch. They'd invested so much emotional energy in protecting Haley and blaming me that acknowledging the truth meant admitting they'd been wrong about everything. Mom's first response to Haley's confession was to suggest that Derek had forced her to do things against her will, while Dad wondered whether the pressure I'd put on the family had driven Haley to make desperate choices. The moment that finally broke through their denial came when Patricia played security footage showing Derek and Haley laughing together while going through my personal belongings, clearly enjoying their scheme rather than acting under duress. The casual, celebratory nature of their theft made it impossible to maintain the narrative that Haley was purely a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Dad's first honest conversation in years happened during a break in the formal proceedings, when he pulled me aside and admitted that he'd been afraid to confront Haley directly about her problems. "I knew something wasn't right," he said quietly, "but your mother was so convinced that we needed to protect her, and I didn't want to be the one to destroy our daughter's life. I thought if we just supported her enough, she'd figure it out on her own." Mom's journey from defensive anger to grudging acknowledgement took longer and involved several attempts to resurrect old narratives about family loyalty and forgiveness. But even she couldn't ignore the evidence of Derek's manipulation and the extent of the criminal activity that had been occurring. Her final admission came with tears and apologies, but also with a request that we find a way to help Haley without completely destroying her future prospects. The choice Patricia presented to Haley was stark but fair. Accept entry into a court-mandated addiction treatment program with full restitution for stolen funds, or face prosecution for multiple felony charges including forgery, identity theft, and fraud. The treatment option included supervised financial counseling, regular drug testing, and complete severance of contact with Derek and his criminal associates. Extended family members who learned the true scope of what had been happening gradually shifted their support from Haley to me, many expressing embarrassment about their previous criticism of my handling of the situation. The family narrative that had painted me as cruel and selfish collapsed when confronted with evidence of systematic criminal activity and manipulation. Marcus's job recommendation for a fresh start opportunity came at exactly the right time, offering me a chance to rebuild my career in a new environment where this family drama wouldn't follow me. The position was a promotion with better pay and benefits, located far enough away to create healthy distance from the chaos but close enough to maintain the supportive relationships I'd built. Rosa's continued mentorship helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't unusual family conflict but a textbook case of scapegoating and financial abuse. Her wisdom about setting boundaries and maintaining them became the foundation for rebuilding healthy relationships with family members who were willing to respect my autonomy and acknowledge past mistakes. Derek's arrest on outstanding warrants from other states provided closure to that part of the nightmare while confirming that our family hadn't been his first target. Police investigators revealed that he'd been running similar schemes with other families, always targeting situations where addiction or mental health issues created vulnerability and dysfunction that he could exploit for financial gain. 6 months after that nightmare conference room confrontation, I stood in my new apartment across town, surrounded by boxes containing the life I was rebuilding piece by piece. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew my family's history, and where I could finally breathe without waiting for the next crisis call or manipulation attempt. The promotion Stephen had offered me came with a significant salary increase and, more importantly, the opportunity to work with a team that respected professional boundaries and personal autonomy. My new colleagues saw me as I actually was, a competent professional who could manage complex projects and lead successful campaigns, rather than the stressed, overwhelmed person I'd become while trying to manage my family's chaos. Haley's progress in court-mandated treatment was slow but genuine, marking the first time in years that she was receiving professional help for her addiction rather than family enabling disguised as support. The structured program included financial counseling, addiction therapy, and regular accountability check-ins that were helping her understand the real impact of her choices on herself and others. Her letters of apology, while still somewhat self-serving, showed glimmers of actual self-awareness that gave me hope for her eventual recovery. My parents' journey through family therapy was perhaps more difficult than Haley's addiction treatment, requiring them to confront decades of dysfunctional patterns and acknowledge their role in enabling destructive behavior. Mom's tendency toward emotional manipulation was being addressed through individual counseling, while Dad was learning to find his voice in family decisions rather than defaulting to passive agreement with whatever would avoid conflict. The family therapy sessions I occasionally attended were structured, supervised conversations that bore no resemblance to the chaotic emotional ambushes that had characterized our previous interactions. With a neutral third party facilitating discussion, my parents were learning to hear my perspective without immediately dismissing it or turning it into evidence of my selfishness. Dad's individual therapy was revealing the extent to which he'd abdicated his parental responsibilities over the years, allowing Mom to make all the difficult decisions while he maintained plausible deniability about their consequences. Learning to take ownership of his choices and express his opinions directly was challenging for someone who'd spent decades avoiding conflict through strategic silence. Marcus had become more than a professional mentor. Our friendship had deepened through the crisis in ways that felt authentic and lasting. His consistent support during my worst moments had shown me what healthy relationships looked like. People who offered assistance without expecting control, who listened without judgment, and who respected boundaries even when they disagreed with choices. Rosa's wisdom continued to guide my healing process as she helped me understand the generational patterns that had shaped my family's dysfunction. Her perspective on breaking cycles of manipulation and guilt helped me see that changing my responses to family pressure was actually a gift to future generations who wouldn't have to repeat these same destructive patterns. My own therapy journey was helping me rebuild my sense of self-worth after years of believing that my value was determined by my willingness to sacrifice for others. Learning to say no without guilt, to set boundaries without apology, and to prioritize my own well-being without shame was more difficult than any professional challenge I'd ever faced, but infinitely more important. The return of my grandmother's jewelry from the pawn shop felt symbolic of reclaiming my family history on my own terms. These pieces, which had been passed down through generations of strong women, would continue their journey with me as I created new traditions based on healthy relationships rather than obligation and manipulation. Holiday celebrations looked completely different now, built around chosen family that included Marcus, Rosa, and other friends who'd supported me through the crisis. These gatherings were smaller but infinitely more peaceful, focused on genuine connection rather than the performance of family harmony that had characterized previous years. The wisdom I'd gained through this experience extended far beyond my personal relationships and into my professional life, where I was better able to recognize manipulation tactics and maintain appropriate boundaries with colleagues and clients. The skills I'd learned in protecting myself from family exploitation proved invaluable in navigating workplace politics and professional challenges. My relationship with Haley was slowly rebuilding on new terms that required honesty, accountability, and respect for boundaries. Her recovery was her responsibility, not mine, and our interactions were limited to situations where mutual respect was possible. This was a fundamental shift from the previous dynamic where her problems automatically became my emergencies. The financial recovery process was ongoing but manageable, with restitution payments coming through the court system and insurance covering some of the identity theft damages. More importantly, I'd implemented financial security measures that would prevent future exploitation, including credit monitoring, secure document storage, and limited access to personal information. The most profound change was in my understanding of what family actually means. True family support doesn't require sacrifice of personal well-being or acceptance of abuse in the name of loyalty. Healthy families celebrate individual success rather than seeing it as an opportunity for exploitation. Love doesn't demand the surrender of autonomy or the acceptance of manipulation. As I reflected on the journey from that horrible Tuesday evening when I'd been ambushed in my childhood kitchen to this peaceful morning in my new home, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't in exposing the criminal activity or forcing accountability from my family members. The real triumph was in learning that I had the right to protect my own peace, to build relationships based on mutual respect, and to define my own boundaries regardless of other people's expectations or demands. The life I was building wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Every choice I made was based on my own values and priorities rather than someone else's manipulation or guilt. I'd learned the difference between helping and enabling, between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and family dysfunction. Most importantly, I'd discovered that breaking free from toxic patterns wasn't selfish or cruel. It was necessary for creating the kind of life and relationships that actually deserved protection and nurture. The family I was creating through choice rather than obligation was smaller but infinitely more fulfilling than the chaos I'd left behind. These were people who celebrated my success rather than seeing it as an opportunity, who supported my growth rather than trying to control my choices, and who offered love without conditions or manipulation. This was what healthy relationships looked like, and it was worth fighting for. If you've experienced similar family manipulation or financial abuse, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. How did you break free from toxic family patterns? What signs should others watch for? Please share your experiences to help others who might be going through similar situations. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself from family members who exploit your love and generosity. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you have the right to build a life based on respect, boundaries, and genuine love. Your peace of mind isn't selfish, it's necessary. Take care of yourselves out there.